Hey, Daily Dosers. There's a phrase in the Bible in a little small book just before the book of Job called Esther. And the phrase that stuck out to me from the time I heard it, really understood what it meant, was "for such a time as this." And it's said by a man named Mordecai. As we're in this series of Unsung Heroes, often in many stories in the Bible, there's these characters that play. They're not the main character. Like in a movie, you get this best supporting actor, and I think in the book of Esther, Mordecai would have won the award for best supporting actor here, but he wouldn't have gotten best actor or the accolades and the praise that most people would have gotten. But his character throughout this story is one that I think deserves us taking a moment and really looking at. He has this interaction with his cousin Esther, who he raises. Her mother and father had passed away, and as a righteous man and a good person, he takes her in, raises her, it says, as his own daughter. And then though they are in captivity under the rule of another king, then this decree goes out. And Mordecai does a couple things. He does one where he foils a plot to kill the king. And this feat that he does is recorded in the Chronicles of the king. And then one night it says that the king couldn't sleep, and he calls to get this book to read through these Chronicles. And he reads through how this plot to kill the king was foiled by this person named Mordecai. And he calls to his servants. He's like, "Has anyone ever done anything for this person?" And he says, and the guy says, no one ever has. So he calls in this man named Haman, who actually despised the Jews. And he had this plot, Haman did, to actually destroy all the Jews. Hated them so much, especially Mordecai. And the king calls in Haman, and in kind of a fun twist of the story, he says, "What should the king do for somebody who has done really well? Like, what should we bless this person?" And Haman's thinking that he's talking about himself, and he's like, "Oh yeah, you should do great stuff for this person." And so the king goes on to talk about the things that he would do, give him his horse and these robes, these fine things. And Haman's like, "Oh, this all sounds like great stuff." And then he goes, "Go and do that for Mordecai." And then he's like, "Wah, wah, wah." He's like, "Mordecai? That's my enemy," And so it just fuels this hatred that Haman has, to the point that he then, in a sense, kind of convinces the king for the destruction of all the Jews. And yet Esther, in this book, has become in this special place, and yet no one knows that she's a Jew. And so she has this choice to make, and Mordecai encourages her to go and speak to the king, even though if she walks into the king's court uncalled, that the law is that if you walk into the king's court and you weren't invited in, that you are to be put to death, unless he holds out the gold scepter and basically pardons you in a sense. And so she is fretting over this decision. Do I walk in, risk my life to save my people? And Mordecai says this, and I think it's so telling of his character, and I think we can learn a lot from it. He says this: "Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, 'Do not think of yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this?'" And so he's basically, in a bigger perspective, asking Esther to consider, has God not brought you where he's brought you, through captivity, into the king's palace, into this place of nobility, for such a time as this? That he's basically saying God is at work, and maybe this is that big decision you need to make for such a time as this. And then Esther goes on to share her resolution to do this. She says, "Go and fast." And then she says, "Though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." And so that, if you've read the book of Esther, that tends to be the key phrase. But for me, it always stood out, that phrase, "such a time as this." And I think Mordecai in the book of Esther, as kind of best supporting actor, doesn't quite get the same accolade that Esther does. But I think he plays such a huge role. It shows that as he raised her as his own daughter, that the character that he bestowed onto her as a Jew. And so for each of us, I think the lesson that we take is, can we live a life of character according to the teachings of God, according to the commands and the way that we are to live in light of God's word, in a righteous life? That we would be the type of people of such noble character that we would, one, see that God is at work, and that sometimes the tough decision we have to make, that we have been placed in the place that we are, in the life of the people that we're in, for such a time as this. And with the world going on around us, that there may be a situation in your life right now that it's such a time as this moment. And that we could have that same, even if I perish mentality, that I'm going to do what's right because I should. And that we could have the wisdom to discern that and live in that mentality. And so that's my encouragement for you, to be like Mordecai, to say maybe that God has worked in your life for such a time as this. Have a good day, Daily Dosers.